The door to my room slowly opened, the soft sound almost imperceptible, which immediately woke me up, and I didn't move. I simply watched with the heart barking quickly while the figure of my priest stood out in the shadows and didn't notice anything, so he fell there in it. I stood at the door and looked at myself with an expression that I had never seen before. It was as if I wanted to say something, but the words remained trapped in my throat. My thoughts spun in 1,000 directions, and I still felt uncomfortable and didn't know how to react. Why was I there? What I was looking for? For a few seconds that seemed eternal, our eyes met in the darkness. It was not the type of gaze you share with someone every day. There was something on his face, something that I had never noticed before. It was a mix of worry, but also something more that I couldn't identify, but it put my nerves on edge, trying to calm my breathing, but every second was longer, dense, but heavy. My father said a step was inside, but then, as if suddenly he had a change of opinion, if he stopped and closed the door behind him, leaving the room in an unsettling stillness during the rest of the night that woke me up by going back to what had happened. Why did I come in? Because I didn't say anything? This wasn't the type of thing that happened in our family. If we had always been close to each other, but we had never shared moments of silence, so much extraños. My thoughts were chaos, and the more I tried to give meaning to what had happened, the more confused I felt. The image of him standing at the door didn't come out of my mind. There was something in his man that was worth watching me that made me feel uncomfortable and at the same time intrigued. By the morning, when everything seemed normal, my father was sitting in the kitchen reading the newspaper as if he always didn't mention what happened last night, and I also dared to take up the topic. Maybe I thought it was just my imagination? Quite simply, I remember having entered my room, but even more so than trying to convince me of that sensation, there was something that had changed between us, but I didn't manage to put a name to that change, and the day lasted without incident. I went to the university and had a lot of tasks, and when I returned home I tried to act as if I was all good, but there was something in the environment. Something that didn't leave me of pulsing in the background of my mind every time I saw him, noticing. That same look that I had seen the night before without pretending that nothing had happened in the past was all in my head, or I really had something that I didn't dare to say. In the silence between us, he felt heavier than ever that night after the extra sensation he had left, and decided that it was the best. It would be distracting to my mother. When I was at home again, I would go on a trip for work, which meant that Dad and I would be alone every week, and we were used to these silences between us. But this time it seemed different. Everything seemed different since the night before. I decided to go down. Going to the kitchen to see what I was doing is where I found cooking something that I could only do when my mother wasn't there, and offered me help him by trying to make him. Environment was lighter at first. Everything seemed normal. Let's talk about things. Trivia about work, age and climate. But there was something in the air, something that I felt tense while I was there sometimes. Vegetables tells me that every time. That moved me a little more about him. Gaze fell on me more than him. I usually keep myself from feeling restless, but I don't say anything. I think that maybe I am exaggerating. However, when I went to reach a knife at our table, brothers, if it wasn't a simple touch, accidental, was one of those moments that they seem to last longer than they should. Our sights crossed, and something in me, if you could stop without your breathing, something accelerated, and before I could processing what is going on, as if tilted me unexpectedly. Kiss me was a brief kiss, as if it was an impulse that I couldn't contain. Even though I was surprised, I couldn't react. Immediately my mind was blank. What was there in the past? What did it mean? I'm constantly looking for an explanation on his face, but he just moved away, slightly, as if it were the same. I was surprised by what I had just done. Succeed. The silence that followed. Deafening. Person could hear the barking of my own heart while I was working on understand what has just happened. I feel like murmuring at the end without looking at them. Ojos no sek me. I passed my head, followed, running around without knowing what to decide at all. I felt unreal, as if I hadn't just finally succeed me apart without deciding nothing, and I went back to focusing on what we were doing before. We pretended nothing. It was long ago that everyone followed. Just like, but I knew in the background that nothing. It would be the same after that moment. He rest of the scene passed in silence. Uncomfortable, we both avoid looking at each other and speak more than necessary. When finally we finished, I went up to my room so as fast as I could, trying to escape the discomfort that surrounded me these days. Followers were extraños in my priest. We didn't mention what happened. In the kitchen we worked on act as if nothing was as long ago as that one. Kiss on Hubiera changed nothing but their truths that everything had changed and it. We knew every time we crossed paths. In the house, avoid eye contact and conversations were brief but empty. The silence lasted until a third member of our small family, always present, always uncomfortable. Saturday afternoon it is suggested that we went out for a walk. It was something that we were alone when Mom wasn't there like that. I wasn't surprised by the proposal, but something inside me was tense despite. We all agreed to go out walking for a while. Park that falls near our house. One who needed to be full of children, playing and families enjoying the day. But for some reason this day was completely empty. The wind moved them, fallen leaves and the sound of ours. Footsteps on the ground seemed to resonate. With more strength than usual we walk in silence during a good mouse L. Environment was busy but no one. They dared to decide what. I really thought finally my father broke the silence with a question. Unexpectedly, have you ever asked yourself, how would things be if we were so excited? Made different decisions. His tone was so soft that I didn't hear him stopping me, and he tried to understand what he wanted to say, and I didn't respond immediately. But something in his question made me deeply uneasy, and he continued walking slowly, as if his words didn't change the weight that I felt, but each step seemed to be more distance between us physically and emotionally. My thoughts began to take hold in my head. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened in the kitchen. That was what I wanted to decide. I was looking for a way to explain it. I didn't know how to react. When I decided, suddenly I stopped and looked directly into my eyes. His expression was serious, but there was also something. But sometimes I feel that there are things that we simply cannot control, I say in a low voice every time, as if I were talking to myself before I could process his words. He turned to lean back before me, and before he told me, his lips started touching my eyes. This time it wasn't an impulsive or unexpected kiss. It was slower but full of emotions, and I was paralyzed for a moment, unable to decide what was going to happen inside me. I screamed that it was wrong, but at the same time I couldn't stop it immediately, finally pulling it aside gently without deciding. A word is left motionless for a few seconds before saying, a step back on his face reflecting confusion and regret. I feel like whispering once more, but this time his voice was more defeated, as if he had overcome that with these words not enough. We walked home in complete silence. My head continued to run around trying to give meaning to what had just happened. I could not deny that something inside I had changed, but I didn't want to think about the implications of all this. When we arrived at the house, I simply went up to my room without looking back, feeling like an invisible barrier had been raised between us, a barrier that no one of them knew how to tear down. The days that followed walk in the park was a kind of silent truce between my father, and no one of them mentioned the kiss, and we acted as if the air was not loaded with everything that we did not dare to decide, as if our relationship was not converted into a game of precaution and care. But there was a tension that was impossible to ignore, an inconvenience that involved us every time we were in it. Room one afternoon, while my mother was out of the house and only had a few hours left before she came back and decided to distract me. The house was quiet, and my father was in the living room reading a magazine in a distracted way. It was a Saturday, and the atmosphere was one of dreams that anticipated something, but I can't see exactly what was on the old shelf where we kept some table games that we hadn't played. For years, we kept my mother hating these games because I always lost, and when I was in a bad mood, I hated losing. Only a few days with a half smile of frustration every time we proposed a game, but I knew that my father, despite everything, had always enjoyed my father calling him from the other side of me. The room looking at the shelf. What does it seem like if we played one of these like when I was little? I lifted the view, surprised but with a smile. Put it on your lips and you believe that you know how to play Bromeo by closing the magazine and standing on your feet. I'm sure I'll win you. As I always responded when dealing with ignite, that spark of normality that we missed so much. Lastly, we sat at his table, eater where the afternoon light shines, warm filter for the chosen window. Of the simplest games, something that it required thinking too much to move them. Things and kingdoms as we alone did it. As the game progressed, tension that existed between us began to fade a little for a few moments. It was as if everything was good. New, as if we could ignore what had happened. Remember how Mom always hated this game, say moving a plug yourself. I replied, laughing when I like to lose. I have never tasted your words, onk. Light ones bring with them an echo of reality. My mother would be ready. Return, and this little moment of normality between us. I would disappear in an hour, I told me. Priest, looking at his watch. Maybe we should catch her before she arrives. You know how to put it on, but I didn't want to. That the moment will end one more time, I asked. Expanding words like solia osea. When I was a little girl and I wanted to convince him. Something, just a game, but I promise that it will be quick. You see me wondering why. Second, and luego with a smile. Resigned. I accept it, it's fine, but only one. We started again and everything seemed to flow. No problems. How would we get back? I'll past a few more years, but as the game progressed I felt how his gaze became fixed in. More than normal. For a second I thought maybe I was imagining it was my own discomfort that I projected. Things that weren't there, but there. Looking up makes me realize that I'm not. It was just my imagination. It amazed me. A different way, with something in your head. Eyes that I couldn't identify at all. Something that made me feel out of place. As if the dirt is low, my pies are not there. The key sound was stable. Spinning in the lock in the Hizzo jump. To both of them, my mother was leaving before. I expected it quickly, say starting. Collect the pieces of the game feeling. That's something more than the table should be. Hidden. My father Hizzo the same, and in a few seconds the game disappeared. At the table, when my mother entered the dining room, everything was in its place but the air. I was still loaded with this invisible tension. What did anyone ask her, looking at nearby with a light flavor like you? Hubiera interruptido, something that is not. I was able to understand nothing, I replied. Too fast. We were alone. Charlondo, a little truth, Daddy, my voice. Sanaba Ada, but she didn't seem to notice. Nothing was normal. I'm glad that if. Levin, so nice to say to her while. Leave your pocket on the table and go. In my kitchen, father. Why? Yo, we look at each other. Briefly, and in that gaze I understood that. The silences between us alone. They will go deeper into the trip to the house. De Campo was my father's idea. I say that. We need to collect a few things. Before selling it. Definitely the house is stable. It takes most of the time since. That we were always small for me. It had been a place full of memories during the long summer afternoons, the cool evenings next to the chimenea and the endless days of open-air games. But now, without the hindrance, the idea of returning there alone gave me an extraneous sensation whenever it was uncomfortable on the road to the house. The countryside was familiar, but the landscape seemed different this time when autumn had painted the trees of ochre and red tones and the leaves fell slowly as we advanced along the serpentine path, and the silence between us was more noticeable than ever, and the air inside the coach was so dense that it seemed that any word we said could break something that I had been tense for too long. When I got there, the place looked the same as it always had, but somehow differently, as if an invisible shadow covered every corner of the wooden house with its powdery windows, and its neglected garden seemed frozen for all that time trapped in a. After we couldn't revive, my father turned off the engine, but no one moved for a moment. I felt that we both knew that something important was about to happen, but no one dared to say it. Finally it was silence. Let's go, and I say with a tone of voice who dreamed more like an order than like an invitation. Assenti, and followed it to the main door. The lave chirped as it turned around, closed and opened. The smell of old wood and octopus enveloped us immediately. The light of the evening filtered through the windows, illuminating the particles of octopus that floated in the air as if the place had been waiting for us all this time. Nothing seemed to have changed. The same furniture, the same curtains drawn by the time, the family photographs in the rest of the room. I looked around the room with the view, feeling small, as if I had gone back 4 years at a time. My father then walked slowly, as if each step had forced him to face the memories he preferred. Let's get buried. I'm going to review the tick. I suddenly knew that this place held a lot of our things childhood and offered me help, but it's the business with my head at the best time here. I answered something in its tone, and I felt like I needed to be alone for a moment until I stopped going up the stairs while I fell in the room looking at the photos in them. One wall in particular called me for attention. When I had 7 years, when I hugged my mother and my father in front of the country house. Everyone smiling at everyone who sold them. Then they approached me, and when I took the landmark between my brothers, I felt a naked in the throat. When everything changed at that moment, our family that was once so united began to fall apart slowly, and was most important poor that I hadn't noticed before. That now seemed so evident, while my thoughts became entangled, when I heard the cross on the ladders of my priest lying in a lacquer, with a small box between my hands, looking at what I found with a medium smile, old photos of your drawings including you. We played with our eyes and looked at our eyes, trying to dream, but all we felt was a mixture of confusion and nostalgia. We sat in the dirt of it. Room surrounded by boxes, opening albums and looking at photos of simpler times for a moment, when it seemed like everything was good as new, as if we could forget what had passed between us. But every time our gazes crossed, that same tension came back to emerge as a remembering that nothing would be the same in a moment. While he looked at a photo in silence, I felt the need to break the barrier that separated us. Dad started, but the words were in my throat. I didn't know that I wanted to say exactly. I just felt that something had to happen. Being said, but I didn't know how to express it. Is when I saw his eyes full of a mix of feelings that I could decipher it. You know, I say it slowly, I've been thinking a lot about what we've experienced in all that we've been through. Your words seem loaded with a weight that I hadn't noticed before. It's always easy to know that it's right. We continue to sometimes make decisions that sometimes seem wrong. We felt that we couldn't help but respond to everything we wanted was that this conversation wouldn't happen, but at the same time we felt that it was inevitable. We had gotten too close to something dangerous, and now we were at a point where any word could change the entire silence between us. Volvio, but this time it was different. It was a silence full of questions that no one of them was asking to respond. I suddenly felt that I couldn't be there any longer, and I got up and walked to the wind. Looking at the garden covered with dried leaves, Dad said without turning me back to look at it, I believe that it's best that we go back to the house. My voice is firm, but inside, everything falls apart. He didn't respond right away, leaving me standing there waiting for him to say something that could fix what was broken, until I knew it was impossible. After a few seconds that seemed like hours, I heard the sound of his steps approaching, and I felt his hand on my shoulder with a gentle touch. Loaded with meanings that I couldn't and didn't want to interpret, I finally said, it's best that we get back on the road home. It was silent, but not this comfortable silence that we could share in the past. Was different, loaded with words and emotions that mixed between what was right and what we shouldn't have felt. My father at the wheel kept his gaze fixed on the road while the other landscape passed unnoticed across the road. From the window, I couldn't stop thinking about what happened in the country house. With every glance and every word we shared, I knew that even though we tried to ignore it, something irreparable had happened between us. When we finally got to the house and the sky began darkening and a thin light rain falling, creating soft splashes on the windshield as you enter the warmth we received, but that feeling of familiarity that we could only offer now seemed like nothing was the same. But nothing was like. My mother was in the china preparing the scene and greeted us with a carefree smile. It seemed relieved to see us return, ignorant of the emotional storm that would focus on. Nosotros. How was the trip? Asked without raise the sight of my father. I responded with a good neutral tone. We found some things that we forget. That I limit myself to mumbling something unintelligible before excusing me and going up. Quickly come to my room once inside, close the door and support me. She feels like the emotions that had been holding it all day. They began to overwhelm my heart as it was. Quick and mind me, don't hesitate to repast everything that has happened in the last few years. Last few days I approached the wind and Maya came like drops of rain falling on the crystal, sliding your weight slowly lower as if they tried drag. I can manage the confusion that I felt hidden. A gentle blow on the door and before who could answer my priest? I can talk to you, I say without waiting for me. Tono's response was serious, but also there was a fragility in his voice that I heard that before I was left on my feet in front of the wind without knowing if I wanted. Face what is about to come. Listen to it as it approaches. Space as if you were afraid of crossing. One line. Invisible. If all this has been difficult to understand for you, for me, but I want you to separate that you never wanted to happen. Feel uncomfortable with your loud voice. Lightly and for the first time and much. I saw my father for a while not like her figure. Strong that had always been a belle as. Someone vulnerable lost in your system. My own feelings turned me towards. Look at it. Daddy, what's going on? Admit me. Voice just a whisper in what happens. With all this my confession makes me sad. Exposed, but it was the truth, Estaba. Trapped in a network of emotions. Contradictions that I could not unravel, and every time you try. Finding an answer left me with more time. Chaos is approaching a little more, but I keep a prudent distance, yo. I didn't even answer him sincerely. Only if something changed between us, and I can't ignore it, but I also know that this is not good because it shouldn't be like this. His words are full of regret in the offer nobody. Solutions simply describe it. Reality in which we were trapped. The silence took over the room. Once more we both knew we were together. At a point without return, and whatever step we would take from now on would mark the rest of our lives. So my mother called us from there. Cooking Larsina has been on the list since. I lower my voice to everything that happens. In that little room it was almost ironic. Think about the normality that never existed. Out of these walls it will be better than, let's say, breaking the silence. Father began slowly but not. I moved immediately and watched as I watched. I tried to find the words but I seemed so lost. Like I finally I said a step ago, like you Hubiera. Made an internal decision, here we go. I responded to his barely audible voice, let's go. The stairs in silence, each one lost in his own thoughts there. Incident-free scene. My mother. Talk happily about your day. We agreed and responded to him fairly. Maintaining the facade of a family. Normal, but inside I felt like everything was on the verge of collapsing. After the scene, I went back to my room looking for refuge in the only place where I could be alone with my thoughts. Everything is inside of me. It was as if something was broken and I had no way of arranging it. Suddenly I heard my mother's voice from the country. I was speaking in a low tone. I was whispering but loud enough. How could I hear it? Why is it so rare? Recently I asked him with an evident concern in his voice. My heart stopped for a second when I didn't know who he was talking about, but it was clear that he had noticed something. I got closer to the door, trying to hear my father's answer better. His calm but tense voice was nothing. So we had a lot to think about, but even through the door I could tell that he wasn't standing sincerely with my mother. Even though I didn't, I insisted, even though your tone was still full of doubts. I hope you're not hiding something from me. I finally say before I finish the matter and return to the kitchen, where I'm standing there on the door feeling how the weight of the situation becomes increasingly unbearable. You know that we couldn't go on like this for a long time. Something had to change. But what would happen when my priest would come to me that night? Thoughts that I didn't have an answer, asking me how much longer we could maintain this farce, and the worst part of all was that in the background I feared the truth as much as I feared continuing to live in this lie before turning off the light, only falling into darkness and the unanswered questions.